So we've had this conversation. I thought it was fascinating, so I wanted to share it with other people. How is it that India has developed such sophisticated medicine and spiritual philosophies that, in the West, there's all these things that we've been doing, but a lot of people in the West are coming back to these because the things that we've been doing in the West aren't working.
Yeah, so it's a really good question, and there's a little bit of a geography lesson, a little bit of a history lesson. This is what I studied in my undergrad. I studied Sanskrit as my major alongside just studying India and its diaspora, so how it kind of spread out of India, the culture, the medicine, the language, and all of that. So it's going to be a little bit of a lesson in all of that. But essentially, so the Indian subcontinent is separate from the Asian continent. And, hundreds of thousands of years ago or millions of years ago, this continent slowly migrated upward from where Antarctica would be and essentially rammed into that subcontinent of Asia. And that created the Himalayan mountains, which are massive. They're really, really big. Beneath that was this valley called the Indus Valley. And essentially, early people crossed these treacherous mountains and sort of established life on this subcontinent, but they were very protected by mountains on both sides. There's the Indus Mountains and then the Himalayas. And so it was difficult for other people to get in and out of this Indian subcontinent, which led to not too much warfare, lack of warfare in general. It was a relatively peaceful place. There's an abundance of food because it's a tropical or subtropical climate. So there was, tons of food. People were able to, there was just more abundance and less competition for resources because there were just fewer people at that point. So the idea, the theory is that because their physiological needs were met, they were able to use their time observing the universe and documenting it extensively, and developing a highly complex language and highly developed or complex social systems, for good or for bad. That's how it happened. That's why there's this really extensive caste system, very extensive, diverse Indian languages. I think there's something like 32 national languages in India or something. In the north, most of them came from Sanskrit, which was never actually a spoken language. It was a language of the scholars, a language of people that were generally religious or doctors or things like that. But essentially, they were able to have time and energy to just start communicating, writing, documenting, and meditating. And the idea is they meditated in caves in the Himalayas and took tons of time to do their research. And out of that came both Ayurvedic medicine and all of the Vedas, and then texts after that. And Ayurveda is part of the main Vedas, which are kind of the deepest texts that have been documented and the oldest texts that have been documented. And yeah, Ayurveda came from that. So in essence, needs were met, not a lot of violence, people had food, they had time and energy to just kind of start paying deeper attention to more subtle, penetrating into more subtle layers of reality, we could say.
Yeah, so I think there's some things in Ayurveda, like for instance in Ayurveda, that would be impossible for somebody to know or physically observe. I'm wondering how they came up with some of these things.
So in essence, the origins, again, sort of the lore behind it, is that these rishis or these seers would sit, and generations of them would sit in these caves in the Himalayas, meditating day in and day out. And kind of the idea of opening their third eye and having sort of downloads from the universe, or awarenesses, higher awarenesses of, again, these larger patterns in the universe. So it is thought that, or it is, the lore goes that a lot of this was channeled. The other thing that I didn't mention is that the first surgeons were Ayurvedic surgeons. So people were actually doing human dissection on bodies that had died to learn what was happening internally. And they were describing organs. They were describing, like, way before, even in the West, they were doing surgeries like this. They were looking at what was going on the inside. And so more of the energetic focus, like the nadis, et cetera, did come from like these downloads or these awarenesses through deep transcendental meditation, and sort of merging with universal consciousness. But also, again, that's where the scientific aspect comes from. They would do all of this dissection and see, oh, this connective tissue connects to this area over here. This connective tissue connects to this other region very far away. And then they started experimenting with these vital points to access the mind or to access the body, and different, again, pushing on a point on your ankle can help your kidneys function better, things like that. So they started with, again, more like research, and then they started applying it and seeing that in a very structured way, certain things held up no matter who the human in front of them was. And so that's where the nadis, which are accessed through the marma points or the marmani, which again was moved to Chinese or to China and became the acupuncture points, and they started to actually puncture the points. Ayurveda does not puncture the points. They only massage or use essential oils, things like that on those points, because it's thought of as disrupting the flow if you actually put a needle in them. So that's a big way that the two systems of medicine diverge. And I will say the Chinese medicine acupuncture points are even more, they really went into it. Like they took that ball and ran with it and really developed it even further. But it's still there's 72,000 nadis or channels in the body, all with marmani or marma points all over the body that are still used all the time in marma chikitsa or marma therapy in Ayurveda.
Yeah. And so one thing I wanted to add to that was just that Lumna is a great thing to use those Marmani points. For many reasons. One is that it helps with circulation. It helps, when you're working with the points. Is there anything else you wanted to add about that?
Yeah, I mean, I think we're going to get into that a little later, but definitely, I think the most intriguing thing to me in terms of Ayurveda and the Marma or the Marmani is that the mind in Ayurveda is not thought of as the brain. It's separate from the brain. The mind is thought of as a channel that goes through the entire body. It permeates every cell of the body. It is in every cell of the body, but it has its own channel and its own access points. And one of the things that I find fascinating is that the root of the channel is in the heart. So that's very interesting in terms of the sort of mind-body connection and the emotional heart and how it affects the mind, and the physical heart and how it affects the mind. And then where the end of the channel is essentially is on all these Marmani points in the body. So one way to access the mind, if there's a mental imbalance, is through pressing on these various Marmani or Marma points on the body. It has a very big effect on the channel of the mind, we could say. So that the Marma really is, the Marmani are really the bridge between the body and the mind in Ayurveda.
See, yeah. Okay, I think the last thing I wanted to just add to this, just in closing, was that I know you talked about the downloads, and I think for me, as somebody who grew up in Western medicine, I find it fascinating to see how so many things are explained in Ayurveda that make sense to me and that I feel, but that I'm like, how is it possible that somebody could have figured this out? You know what I mean? There's like you can't see the like 72,000 nadis.
Right.
So I think it's just really interesting and fascinating. I'm excited about the next questions coming up.
Actually, I want to just add one more thing to that. There is some preliminary research, at least in it's been much more research in acupuncture, but kind of getting back to the idea of dissection and looking at connective tissues, there is some evidence that, first of all, our connective tissues hold an electrical charge, and that through our fascial network, which is what essentially makes us look how we are, it's what holds our entire body together, the connective tissue that holds us together, it can be both in a liquid state and a solid state that fascia can be. So if you heat up the tissue, like with massage, it actually turns the fascia temporarily into liquid, which is fascinating. And also there's, again, there's some evidence that it can conduct electricity, and that when you put a needle in, like an acupuncture, it interrupts that flow of electricity. And so the idea is that probably all of this energy medicine, all of these nadis, all of these marmani are functioning through the fascia or the connective tissue, which is why we also focus pretty greatly on that in our product, which we'll get to.